Maine, the state that almost nobody talks about yet somehow owns more coastline than California, flooded an entire town underwater, fired the first shot of the American Revolution before most colonists even knew a war had started, and fed lobster to prisoners because it was considered too disgusting to eat. This forgotten frozen corner of America is hiding 71 facts so bizarre, so absurd, and so shockingly real that by the end of this video you're going to question everything you thought you knew about this country. And you're going to be furious. Nobody taught you this in school. Hit that hype button right now. Because the more people who see this, the more Americans find out what's actually been hiding in Maine this whole time. And trust me, your history teacher owes you an apology. 1. Maine is the only U.S. state that shares a border with just one other state, and somehow that state is New Hampshire, a place most Americans forget exists. Every other state on the East Coast is packed in like sardines with neighbors on all sides, but Maine just sits up there in the corner like it does not want to be involved. Geographers call it geographically isolated. Maine residents just call it Tuesday. The entire northeastern tip of America belongs to one stubborn, cold, and largely ignored state. 2. Massachusetts once owned Maine the way a landlord owns a rental property nobody wants. For nearly 2 centuries, Maine had zero political power, zero separate identity, and absolutely zero say in its own future. Massachusetts collected the taxes, made the rules, and treated the entire region like a forgotten storage unit up north. Then in 1820, Congress needed to balance slave states against free states, so Maine was handed its independence not out of respect, but purely as a political bargaining chip. Maine did not earn its freedom. It was used as change in someone else's deal. 3. Maine's coastline stretches over 3,500 miles, which is longer than California's entire Pacific coast, and yet nobody in Maine is actually swimming in that water comfortably for most of the year. California built an entire lifestyle around its beaches, while Maine built a lifestyle around staring at the ocean from inside a heated building, wearing 3 layers of wool. The water is so cold, it will physically punish anyone brave or foolish enough to enter it. Maine has the longest coastline on the East Coast and uses almost none of it for recreational swimming. 4. The entire population of Maine is smaller than the city of San Antonio, Texas. One single Texas city, sitting in the middle of a landlocked desert state, has more human beings living inside it than this massive northeastern state covering thousands of square miles. San Antonio has traffic jams, packed stadiums, and rush hour gridlock. Maine has a moose standing in the road at 2 a.m. with nobody around to witness it. Texas would look at Maine's population numbers and assume something catastrophic had recently happened to the people there. 5. Maine lobstermen in the 1800s did not file complaints or send strongly worded letters when fishing zone disputes got serious. They grabbed actual guns, boarded actual boats, and sank each other's vessels over fishing territory in what historians quietly call the Lobster Wars. Real blood was spilled over crustaceans that at the time were considered garbage food fed to prisoners. These fishermen were out there conducting full naval warfare over an animal that colonists used as fertilizer. Maine settled its seafood disputes the same way other people settled land wars, with cannons and fury. 6. Mount Katahdin in Maine does not follow normal weather rules that apply to the rest of the planet. The summit of this mountain can be locked inside a full whiteout blizzard with violent winds and zero visibility, while the base of the exact same mountain sits in warm golden sunshine with birds chirping peacefully. Hikers have walked up on a clear morning and entered a completely different climate within 2 hours. The mountain essentially generates its own private weather system and does not consult meteorologists or common sense before deciding what conditions to produce on any given day. 7. Maine banned alcohol in 1851, a full 70 years before the rest of America got around to it, and thanks to a man named Neal Dow, who earned the title Father of Prohibition and meant it as a compliment. While the rest of the country was cheerfully drinking its way through the 1800s, Maine residents were living under a statewide ban that most Americans would not experience until 1920. Dow was so proud of this achievement that he ran for President of the United States on it. The rest of America eventually caught up to Maine's misery and then abandoned it within 13 years. 8. Maine has counties where the moose population outnumbers the human population, which sounds like a nature documentary exaggeration, but is simply a census fact. Statistically speaking, a person driving through rural Maine is more likely to collide violently with a moose than to encounter a bear in the wild. Moose collisions in Maine are so common that the state issues official warnings about them, the same way other states warn about potholes. A moose weighs up to 1,500 pounds, stands taller than most trucks, and feels completely indifferent about your travel schedule or your car insurance premiums. 9. Maine covers more total land area than all 5 other New England states combined, which means it is larger than Connecticut, Rhode Island, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts put together. Despite controlling this enormous chunk of northeastern America, Maine holds less than 2% of the entire region's population. It is the geographic equivalent of one person owning 6 houses and choosing to live in a small corner of one room. The other New England states are packed with cities, highways, and universities, while Maine is mostly trees, silence, and the occasional confused tourist who took a wrong turn. 10. Maine did not earn its statehood through revolution, petition, or political ambition. Congress admitted Maine into the Union in 1820, strictly as a bargaining chip to balance the number of slave states against free states under the Missouri Compromise. Maine was essentially currency in a national argument about human slavery that it had nothing to do with starting. Politicians in Washington traded Maine's independence the way someone trades a card in a board game. The people of Maine woke up one day with statehood, not because anyone fought for their identity, but because Congress needed even numbers on a spreadsheet. 11. Maine produces 99% of all wild blueberries grown in the entire United States, making it the most dominant food monopoly that almost no American ever thinks about. Nobody walks into a grocery store and says this blueberry came from Maine with the same energy they say this lobster came from Maine. The wild blueberry industry quietly controls the entire national supply from the fields of Washington County, while the rest of America remains completely unbothered by this information. Maine is running a near-total monopoly on one of America's most consumed fruits and has somehow made it deeply boring news. 12. Maine holds the title of oldest state in America by median age, which means the average Maine resident is older than the average resident of every other state in the country. Entire counties function less like thriving communities and more like very large retirement villages with harsher winters and fewer golf courses. Young people leave Maine for opportunities elsewhere and do not return, which makes the median age climb higher every single decade. The state is essentially aging in place while the rest of America debates youth culture, and Maine debates whether the early bird dinner special should start at 4 or 4:30. 13. Maine's entire economy once ran on cutting frozen lakes into massive blocks of ice and shipping them to places like the Caribbean and South America in the 1800s. Workers would saw through thick lake ice every winter, haul the blocks onto horse-drawn sleds, pack them in sawdust, load them onto ships, and then send frozen Maine water to tropical countries that had never experienced cold in their lives. This industry made Maine genuinely wealthy before refrigeration made the whole operation completely pointless overnight. An entire economic empire built on frozen water simply evaporated the moment someone invented the electric icebox. 14. Every spring, Maine experiences something locals call mud season, which sounds charming until you understand that paved roads across the state literally dissolve into deep rivers of impassable mud that swallow tires whole. The freeze-thaw cycle destroys road surfaces so completely that entire stretches of highway become functionally unusable for weeks. Maine does not panic about this or treat it as a crisis. The state simply accepts mud season as a fifth season that arrives after winter and before anything resembling spring. Other states fix their roads. Maine puts up a sign, shrugs, and waits for the ground to solidify again. 15. Maine has a town called Mexico, and it sits landlocked in the western part of the state surrounded by pine forests, frozen rivers, and temperatures that regularly drop well below zero in January. There is nothing Mexican about Mexico, Maine, in any measurable cultural, geographical, or climatic sense. No warm weather, no desert landscape, no connection to the actual country of Mexico beyond the name someone chose in the 1800s, and nobody ever reconsidered. Residents of Mexico, Maine have spent generations explaining to confused visitors that yes, this is real, no, they cannot tell you why, and yes, it is extremely cold here. 16. Maine is home to the largest black bear population east of the Mississippi River, and unlike most wildlife statistics that describe declining numbers, Maine's black bear population has actually been growing steadily for decades. There are currently estimated to be over 35,000 black bears living in Maine, which is more bears than some entire countries have recorded in their national wildlife surveys. Maine residents in rural areas treat bear sightings with the same casual energy that suburban Americans treat squirrel sightings. The bears are simply there, they have always been there, and they are not planning to leave anytime soon. 17. Every single morning, the first sunrise in the entire continental United States happens at Maine's easternmost point, which means Maine technically starts every American day before any other state gets involved. This extraordinary geographic distinction belongs to one of the least visited and least celebrated corners of the entire country. While other states market their natural wonders aggressively, Maine's sunrise point sits quietly at the edge of the continent, greeting each dawn for an audience of almost nobody. America's most dramatic daily event happens in a place most Americans cannot locate on a map without significant help and 3 wrong guesses. 18. The very first naval battle of the American Revolution did not happen in Boston or Philadelphia, or any place history textbooks tend to highlight. It happened in Machias, Maine, in June of 1775, when a group of local residents decided they had heard enough from the British and captured an armed Royal Navy vessel called the HMS Margaretta, using nothing but a heavily armed attitude and whatever weapons they could grab quickly. Most of the colonists in other states had barely processed the idea that a war was beginning, while Maine was already out on the water capturing British warships and feeling entirely justified about it. 19. Lobster was so completely worthless in colonial Maine that feeding it to prisoners was considered a form of punishment rather than a meal. Indentured servants reportedly negotiated clauses into their work contracts, specifically limiting how many times per week they could legally be forced to eat lobster, because the humiliation of eating it too frequently was considered degrading. Prison guards refused to eat it themselves. The ocean floor along the Maine coast was covered in the creature that would eventually become America's most expensive and prestigious seafood, and the people living directly on top of it used it as fertilizer for potato fields. 20. Maine has the highest percentage of French-Canadian descendants of any state in the entire United States, a fact that surprises most Americans who assume that distinction belongs to states that actually border Quebec or have large visible French-speaking communities in their major cities. Entire mill towns in Maine were built by French-Canadian workers who crossed the border, settled permanently, maintained their language for generations, and created communities where English was essentially optional. The French-Canadian cultural influence on Maine is enormous, historically documented, and almost completely invisible to the average American who thinks of Maine primarily as the place where lobster and Stephen King come from. 21. Maine's paper mills once supplied the majority of American newspapers, which meant that nearly every morning paper landing on doorsteps across the country started its life as a Maine forest. Then, the digital age arrived. Newspaper circulation collapsed, advertising revenue vanished, and the paper industry imploded so fast that entire mill towns went from bustling industrial communities to economic ghost towns within a single decade. Workers who had spent their entire lives in the same mill watched the building shut down, the jobs disappear, and the town empty out almost simultaneously. Maine's forests kept growing. The mills just stopped needing them, and nobody had a backup plan. 22. In 1947, a drought hit Maine so severely that when fires started across the state, they found millions of acres of bone-dry forest waiting for them like an open invitation. The Great Fire of 1947 burned over 200,000 acres and tore through entire coastal communities with a speed that gave residents almost no time to react. Bar Harbor, one of Maine's most celebrated coastal towns, watched entire neighborhoods disappear in hours. Odd families grabbed whatever they could carry and ran toward the ocean because there was nowhere else to go. The fire reshaped Maine's coastline communities permanently, and the state has never fully forgotten what that autumn looked like. 23. The town of Eastport sits at the eastern edge of Maine, and is geographically closer to Ottawa, the capital of Canada, than it is to Augusta, the capital of its own state. A Maine resident living in Eastport is physically nearer to a foreign nation's seat of government than to their own state's administrative center, which raises legitimate questions about what being part of Maine actually means on a practical daily basis. Eastport residents could theoretically commute to Canada's capital faster than they could reach their own governor's office. The map of Maine makes this possible, and nobody in state government appears particularly troubled by it. 24. Maine's coyotes are not regular coyotes. Scientists have confirmed through genetic testing that the coyotes living in Maine carry significant wolf DNA, making them a hybrid species that biologists call the coy wolf, a creature that is larger, more intelligent, and more adaptable than a standard coyote, and should not technically exist according to the normal rules of wildlife biology. The coy wolf appeared because eastern wolf populations and coyote populations, interbred as wolves, were hunted to extinction across the region. Maine essentially created a new apex predator through 2 centuries of terrible wildlife management decisions, and the animal has been thriving ever since. 25. Maine has over 4,600 offshore islands sitting in the cold Atlantic waters along its famously long coastline, which sounds like an extraordinary natural paradise until you learn that only 15 of those islands support any year-round human population at all. The rest go completely dark and silent every winter when the last seasonal residents pack up and leave. Over 4,500 islands sit empty through the coldest months, inhabited only by seabirds, seals, and whatever weather system decides to park itself over the Atlantic that week. Maine technically has thousands of islands. Maine functionally abandons almost all of them for roughly 5 months every single year. 26. Maine almost ended up named Ligonia, which was the name seriously proposed by some of the state's earliest English settlers, who apparently looked at this enormous, beautiful stretch of northeastern coastline and thought Ligonia was the correct response. Every person currently living in Maine narrowly escaped spending their entire life telling people they were from Ligonia. Maine residents would be introducing themselves as Ligonians. The state motto, the license plates, the lobster trap tags, all of it would say Ligonia. Somewhere in an alternate timeline there is a state called Ligonia, and its residents have absolutely no idea how lucky the actual Maine residents are. 27. Maine once had a thriving wild shrimp fishery that provided local seafood restaurants and fishing families with a reliable annual harvest for generations. Then in 2013, fishery managers looked at the population data, looked at rising ocean temperatures in the Gulf of Maine, and shut the entire industry down overnight with essentially no warning and no recovery timeline. The shrimp simply disappeared as the water warmed beyond what the species could tolerate. Maine's wild shrimp fishery has not reopened since. An entire coastal industry that fed families and supplied restaurants vanished in a single regulatory decision driven by an ocean that stopped cooperating with the economy built around it. 28. Maine's rural northern counties exist in a version of America that the rest of the country would find genuinely difficult to believe is still legally part of the United States. There is no reliable cell service, no broadband internet, and no mail delivery during winter months across significant stretches of Aroostook County and the surrounding unorganized territories. Residents manage emergencies without being able to call anyone. They receive correspondence only when roads become passable. These communities are fully subject to federal taxation and U.S. law, while receiving almost none of the basic infrastructure services that Americans in other states take for granted every single day without a second thought. 29. Maine operated as a functioning American state for nearly 150 years before anyone in its government got around to implementing a state income tax, which finally arrived in 1969 as if someone suddenly remembered it was an option. From 1820, when Maine achieved statehood, all the way through the Great Depression, 2 World Wars, the Korean War, and most of the Cold War, Maine ran its entire state government without collecting income tax from its residents. Other states had been doing it for decades. Maine just kept finding other ways to pay for things, and apparently nobody in Augusta felt strongly enough about income tax to push it through until the late 1960s finally forced the conversation. 30. In January of 1998, An ice storm hit Maine with such ferocity that it coated everything in the state under inches of solid ice and knocked out electricity to roughly half the entire population for more than 2 weeks in the middle of winter. Trees collapsed under the weight of the ice and took power lines down with them across hundreds of miles of the state simultaneously. Families burned furniture to stay warm. Generators ran until they ran out of fuel. Hundreds of millions of dollars in damage accumulated while the state sat frozen and dark for days that stretched into weeks. Maine has had bad winters. The ice storm of 1998 was something categorically different from a bad winter. 31. Maine has a town called Friendship, sitting right on the coast surrounded by rival fishing communities that have spent generations competing bitterly over the same waters, the same docks, and the same catches. The name Friendship was chosen by someone who either had a tremendous sense of humor or absolutely no awareness of what the local fishing industry actually looked like on a daily basis. Lobstermen in Friendship have historically not been known for their warm, cooperative spirit toward neighboring boats working the same zones. The town sits there with its deeply ironic name painted on a sign, while the fishermen around it conduct business with the warmth of a January nor'easter. 32. Maine's wild turkey population hit absolute zero in 1977, meaning the entire species had been completely wiped out from the state through a combination of overhunting and habitat destruction that left not a single wild turkey anywhere within Maine's borders. Wildlife managers then did something that sounds like a nature documentary plot and simply reintroduced turkeys from other states, releasing them into Maine's forests and hoping for the best. The turkeys responded by thriving so aggressively that Maine now has a turkey hunting season with tens of thousands of birds across the state. Maine killed every turkey it had and then just ordered new ones, like replacing a household appliance. 33. Maine contains over 32,000 miles of rivers and streams flowing through its forests, mountains, and valleys, which is enough combined waterway to wrap around the entire circumference of the Earth more than once, if you laid it all out in a single line. This extraordinary network of freshwater makes Maine one of the most water-rich states in the entire country by any hydrological measurement. Despite this, Maine barely registers in the national consciousness as a water destination, an outdoor recreation hub, or anything beyond lobster and cold weather. The state is sitting on one of America's great natural water systems and has somehow failed to make it part of its identity in any meaningful way. 34. Joshua Chamberlain was a college professor from Maine who taught rhetoric and modern languages at Bowdoin College and had never commanded troops in combat before the Civil War handed him a rifle regiment and pointed him toward Gettysburg. On July 2, 1863, Chamberlain's 20th Maine Infantry held the far left end of the entire Union line at Little Round Top against repeated Confederate attacks until they ran out of ammunition. Rather than retreat, Chamberlain ordered a bayonet charge downhill that broke the Confederate assault and held the position. Military historians credit that decision with preventing the Union line from collapsing entirely. A Maine English professor may have saved the United States of America. 35. Colonial Maine farmers looked at the lobster-covered ocean floor directly beside their fields and made the completely rational 1600s decision to haul the creatures out of the water and plow them directly into the soil as fertilizer for their potato crops. The animal that now sells for $30 a pound at restaurant menus across America was being used to make potatoes grow better in Maine 3 centuries ago. Fields were literally enriched with what modern seafood lovers would consider an obscene waste of premium ingredients. Maine farmers walked past mountains of future culinary gold every single day and saw only a cheap and abundant way to improve their soil chemistry. 36. Maine has more small business owners per capita than most states in America, which sounds like a thriving entrepreneurial economy until you look at where Maine consistently ranks for average personal income and find it sitting near the bottom of nearly every national comparison. Mainers are exceptionally good at starting businesses and exceptionally challenged when it comes to making significant money from those businesses. The state is full of hard-working independent operators running fishing operations, woodworking shops, farms, and small tourism outfits who work extraordinarily long hours for returns that would make residents of wealthier states genuinely uncomfortable. Maine has the hustle. Maine has not yet found a way to turn the hustle into prosperity. 37. During World War II, the federal government looked at a map of American food production and designated Aroostook County in northern Maine as a strategic military food zone, meaning the potato farms of this remote northern county were considered critical national infrastructure for feeding the United States Army. Maine potato farmers went from growing a regional crop to holding a wartime food security designation that put their fields in the same strategic category as ammunition factories and naval shipyards. The Army depended on Aroostook County potatoes to keep soldiers fed across multiple theaters of the war. A cold, remote county in the far northeastern corner of America quietly helped win World War II one potato at a time. 38. Aroostook County in northern Maine regularly receives over 110 inches of snowfall in a single winter season, which is more annual snow accumulation than most locations in the Rocky Mountains receive, despite those mountains being the places Americans typically associate with extreme winter conditions. Aroostook sits in a flat agricultural region with no dramatic mountain peaks to explain the snowfall totals. The snow simply arrives in enormous quantities because of the county's geographic position and atmospheric patterns, and does not stop arriving for months. Residents there treat 110 inches of snow the way Phoenix residents treat 110 degrees of heat, as an unremarkable feature of their environment that outsiders find disturbing and locals find completely normal. 39. Lubec, Maine holds the official distinction of being the absolute easternmost point in the entire continental United States, a geographic title that sounds like it should belong to a thriving city or, at minimum, a notable tourist destination. Lubec has a total year-round population of fewer than 1,400 people. The easternmost point in the lower 48 states is home to fewer residents than a single apartment complex in most American cities. There is a lighthouse, there is cold wind, there is the Atlantic Ocean pressing against the edge of the continent, and there are 1,400 people who have decided that being first to see the sunrise every morning is a perfectly sufficient reason to stay. 40. Maine's colonial and territorial governments placed an official government bounty on wolves and maintained that bounty for over 200 years, systematically paying hunters cash rewards for every wolf killed until the species was completely and permanently eliminated from the entire state. This was not a brief, misguided policy. For 2 full centuries, Maine's government funded the methodical extinction of its wolf population as an official line item in the state budget. The wolf was so thoroughly eliminated from Maine that when coyotes eventually migrated into the region, they found no wolves left to compete with, and interbred with the remaining wolf genetic material drifting down from Canada, producing the coy wolf that now roams the state instead. 41. Maine's Passamaquoddy Bay experiences tidal swings of up to 28 feet between low tide and high tide, making it one of the most extreme tidal ranges recorded anywhere on the surface of the Earth. At low tide, the bay floor is exposed for enormous distances, revealing a landscape of mud, rocks, and stranded sea creatures that looks nothing like the ocean that was sitting there 6 hours earlier. At high tide, the same area is buried under nearly 3 stories of seawater. Boats that were floating peacefully in the morning are sitting on the mud floor by afternoon. Maine's ocean does not behave like a normal ocean and considers dramatic twice-daily transformations to be a completely standard Tuesday. 42. In the 1850s, Maine voters elected politicians from a party called the Know-Nothings, whose entire political identity was built around members claiming they knew nothing about the party's activities whenever anyone asked them questions, which was somehow considered a reasonable platform for governing a state. The Know-Nothing Party won significant Maine elections during a decade when the state was also banning alcohol and preparing to enter a civil war. Maine looked at its available political options in the 1850s and decided the candidates who literally ran on institutionalized ignorance as their defining characteristic were the ones most deserving of public trust and electoral victory. American politics has always been exactly this way. 43. Maine's sea urchin fishing industry exploded dramatically in the early 1990s, when Japanese markets discovered that Maine urchins produced exceptional uni, the prized roe used in sushi, and were willing to pay extraordinary prices for as many urchins as Maine fishermen could supply. The Maine fishermen responded by harvesting urchins with an enthusiasm that the urchin population was completely unprepared to survive. Within a single decade, the sea urchin population along Maine's coast was commercially devastated, The Japanese market demand evaporated alongside the supply, and an industry that had generated enormous wealth in a very short time simply ceased to exist. Maine found a gold rush in its own ocean and fished it into extinction within 10 years. 44. Maine is one of the most rural states in the entire country by almost every measurement the census uses to define what rural actually means. As of the most recent available data, fewer than 39% of Maine's residents live in anything that qualifies as an urban area under federal classification standards. That means more than 60% of the people in Maine live in conditions that the government categorizes as rural, which in Maine's case often means genuinely remote, genuinely isolated, and genuinely far from the services that urban Americans consider basic features of daily life rather than luxuries. Maine is rural in a way that makes other rural states look suburban by comparison. 45. Maine lobstermen operate their fishing territories through an informal self-governance system that functions completely outside of normal state regulatory frameworks and has no official legal standing whatsoever, yet somehow works with remarkable effectiveness for the people involved. Individual fishing communities divide the coastal waters into zones, establish who has rights to fish where, enforce those boundaries through social pressure and tradition, and resolve disputes through their own council system without involving lawyers, judges, or state officials in any meaningful way. Maine lobstermen have essentially created their own functioning micro-government operating parallel to the actual government, and covering thousands of square miles of ocean that the state of Maine technically claims jurisdiction over. 46. Maine contains a geographic designation called the Unorganized Territories, which covers approximately 10 million acres of the state's interior and is home to almost no permanent residents while being larger than the entire states of Maryland, Vermont, New Hampshire, Connecticut, or Rhode Island individually. These territories have no local government, no municipal services, no elected officials, and no town meetings because there are essentially no towns. The land exists, the trees exist, the rivers and lakes exist, and a very small number of people live there in conditions of extreme self-sufficiency. Maine is one of the most sparsely inhabited states in America, and even Maine has a section that Maine itself considers too remote to bother governing. 47. The town of York in southern Maine was chartered as a city in 1642, making it the oldest chartered English city in all of British North America, and therefore a legitimate candidate for the title of America's oldest city by any reasonable historical standard. Almost nobody claims this. St. Augustine in Florida gets the oldest city conversation. Jamestown gets the oldest settlement conversation. York, Maine, sits there with its 1642 charter, its genuine historical claim, and its almost complete absence from the national conversation about American origins. The oldest chartered city in British North American history is a small Maine coastal town that most Americans have driven past without stopping to consider what they were driving past. 48. Maine is home to an animal called the fisher cat, which is neither a fisher in the aquatic sense nor a cat in any biological sense, but is actually a member of the weasel family that has developed the extraordinary ability to produce nighttime screams that sound with uncanny accuracy like a human being in genuine mortal distress. Residents of rural Maine hear these screams regularly in the darkness outside their homes and have learned to identify them as fisher cats rather than emergencies. Visitors to Maine who hear a fisher cat scream for the first time at 2 a.m. in the woods experience a level of panic that no amount of subsequent explanation fully eliminates from their memory. 49. Monhegan Island sits about 12 miles off the Maine coast and has maintained a complete ban on automobiles for over a century, meaning that every person who lives on or visits the island has walked everywhere they needed to go for more than 100 years without exception. There are no cars, no motorcycles, no motorized personal vehicles of any kind permitted on the island's roads. Residents haul supplies by hand or by small utility vehicles used strictly for specific work purposes. Tourists arrive by ferry and immediately discover that their legs are the only transportation available to them. Monhegan has been car-free since before most Americans owned cars and has absolutely no intention of reconsidering this policy. 50. Maine's indigenous Wabanaki people named this land Dawnland centuries before any European arrived to rename it, claim it, or draw borders across it. And they chose that name because this territory receives the first light of every single day on the North American continent. The Wabanaki understood the geographic significance of living at the eastern edge of the continent and built it into the fundamental identity of the place itself. Their history in Maine stretches back over 10,000 years. Their relationship with this land predates every colonial institution that currently governs it, and their story is almost entirely absent from the history curricula taught in Maine's own schools to this day. EAT 51. Maine's clam flats get shut down for bacterial contamination with a regularity that would alarm most Americans if they stopped to think about it carefully for more than 30 seconds. Health officials close the flats, issue warnings, and post notices that the shellfish beds are unsafe for harvesting. Then the contamination clears, the flats reopen, and Maine residents go right back to ordering fried clams at every available opportunity with the same enthusiasm they had before the closure. Nobody connects the shutdown notices to the basket of clams arriving at their table. Maine has built an entire beloved culinary identity around a shellfish that its own government periodically declares too dangerous to pull out of the ground. 52. Maine carries a serious and worsening opioid crisis, hidden almost completely behind the postcard image of lobster boats, autumn foliage, and peaceful coastal villages that the tourism industry projects to the rest of America. The state consistently ranks among the highest in New England for overdose death rates, with rural communities absorbing the heaviest losses in areas where medical resources are scarce, distances are enormous, and treatment facilities are hours away from the people who need them most. The Maine that appears in travel magazines and the Maine where families are losing people to addiction are the same geographic place wearing two completely different faces for two completely different audiences simultaneously. 53. Maine attempted to build an international railway connecting it to Quebec in the 1800s, which was an ambitious infrastructure project that required enormous capital investment, difficult terrain engineering, and sustained political will across two different countries. It had none of these things in sufficient quantities. The railway went bankrupt before reaching completion, leaving behind miles of abandoned track disappearing into the Maine wilderness, where the forest has spent the subsequent century and a half quietly reclaiming the cleared right-of-way. The rusted rails and rotting wooden ties from this failed international transportation dream still exist in remote stretches of northern Maine, sitting in the trees like a monument to 19th century optimism that ran out of money before it ran out of forest. 54. During Prohibition, Maine's lobster boats discovered a secondary revenue stream that was significantly more profitable than lobster and required working the same coastal routes they already knew by heart. Fishermen loaded their boats with Canadian liquor after dark and ran the same waters they worked every morning, delivering illegal alcohol along the Maine coast, using intimate knowledge of every cove, inlet, and tidal pattern that federal agents in unfamiliar boats simply could not match. The same men who hauled traps at sunrise were smuggling rum by midnight, using vessels that smelled like the sea and looked completely legitimate to anyone watching from shore. Maine's fishing industry and Maine's bootlegging industry shared the same boats and the same families. 55. Maine has a desert. This is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. There is an actual 40-acre sand desert sitting in the middle of one of the most heavily forested states in the entire country, located in Freeport of all places, surrounded by pine trees and tourist outlets. The desert was created when aggressive over-farming in the 1800s stripped the topsoil from the land so completely that the glacial sand deposit beneath was exposed and has been expanding slowly ever since. Maine somehow managed to create a desert through poor agricultural decisions in a region that receives regular rain, abundant snowfall, and has no natural desert-forming conditions whatsoever. Maine farmed so badly it invented a new climate zone. 56. Maine's white-tailed deer population was hunted so aggressively throughout the 1800s that by the end of the century the animals had been reduced to near extinction across the state, dropping from abundant natural populations to almost nothing within a single human lifetime of unregulated hunting. The deer that are now a common sight throughout Maine, causing car accidents and raiding gardens with cheerful regularity, are the descendants of conservation efforts that began only after hunters had nearly finished eliminating the species entirely. Maine spent 50 years hunting its deer population into collapse and then spent the next 100 years carefully rebuilding what it had destroyed, which is a conservation story that begins with an entirely avoidable catastrophe. 57. Maine has more lighthouses than any other state in America, with over 65 of them standing along a coastline that most Americans do not realize is the longest on the entire East Coast. These lighthouses were built because the Maine coast is extraordinarily dangerous to navigate, filled with rocky outcroppings, unpredictable fog, violent tidal currents, and the kind of weather that has been sinking ships for 4 centuries. Every lighthouse on the Maine coast represents a specific location where enough vessels were destroyed that someone decided a warning light was necessary. Maine's coastline is beautiful from a distance and has been actively trying to kill sailors at close range since the first European ships arrived. 58. Harriet Beecher. Stowe was living in Brunswick, Maine, when she sat down and wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, the novel that depicted American slavery with such emotional force that it became one of the most widely read and politically influential books in the country's history. Abraham Lincoln allegedly greeted Stowe at a White House meeting by calling her the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war, which is either historically accurate or historically legendary depending on which scholar you ask. The novel that may have accelerated the American Civil War was written in Maine, in a house that still stands in Brunswick, by a woman who had recently moved there from Ohio and was outraged by what she witnessed. 59. Maine's seaweed industry has quietly grown into a multi-million-dollar operation that is expanding faster than almost any other agricultural sector in the state, generating over $20 million annually and attracting serious investment from food companies, pharmaceutical researchers, and cosmetics manufacturers who have discovered that Maine's cold, clean waters produce exceptionally high-quality kelp and other marine algae. This is genuinely one of the strangest boom industries in contemporary America. A state known for lobster now selling seaweed to international markets at rapidly increasing volumes. Maine built its seafood identity on crustaceans and shellfish, and is now discovering that the stuff growing between the rocks may be worth more attention than anyone previously considered. 60. Maine loses more doctors than it gains every single year, creating a physician shortage that has become so severe in rural areas that some counties now have a single doctor responsible for providing medical care across thousands of square miles of remote territory. Patients in these areas drive hours to reach basic medical appointments that residents of cities receive within a few blocks of their front doors. The doctor shortage is driven by low reimbursement rates, geographic isolation, brutal winters, and the simple fact that most medical school graduates have options, and Maine's options require a very specific kind of person willing to trade urban convenience for extraordinary rural responsibility. Maine is running out of doctors, and the trend is moving in the wrong direction. 61. Maine's tourism industry pulls in billions of dollars every single year from visitors who come for the lobster, the lighthouses, the fall foliage, and the rugged coastal scenery that fills travel magazines with gorgeous photography. The majority of that money flows directly to out-of-state hotel chains, national restaurant corporations, and large vacation property companies that have no meaningful connection to Maine communities beyond the address on their tax filings. Local fishermen, small inn owners, and family restaurants capture a fraction of the economic activity happening around them. Maine has built one of New England's most powerful tourism brands and somehow structured its economy so that most of the financial benefit leaves the state along with the tourists. 62. Maine is the most heavily forested state in the entire United States, with approximately 90% of its total land area covered by trees, which sounds like an extraordinary natural resource belonging to the people of Maine until you examine who actually owns those forests. The majority of Maine's forest land is owned by out-of-state paper and timber corporations that harvest the trees, process the wood elsewhere, employ limited local labor, and return minimal economic benefit to the communities living inside and around the forests. Maine residents are surrounded by 90% tree cover that they do not own, cannot meaningfully profit from, and watch get harvested by companies headquartered in cities that have never experienced a Maine winter. 63. The town of Flagstaff, Maine had residents, buildings, roads, farms, churches, and a complete functioning community until 1950, when the state decided to flood the entire valley for a hydroelectric project, and told the people of Flagstaff that their town was going underwater, whether they were ready or not. Residents were relocated, buildings were burned to the ground to prevent debris in the new reservoir, and the entire community was deliberately submerged beneath what became Flagstaff Lake. The town still sits at the bottom of that lake today. On very clear days in certain water conditions, foundations and remnants of the old community are reportedly visible from the surface, which is either poetic or deeply unsettling depending on your relationship to the idea of home. 64. Maine is one of the only places in the entire continental United States where Atlantic puffins breed and nest in the wild. I'm making it an extraordinary birding destination for a species that most Americans associate exclusively with Iceland or Norway, rather than the northeastern coast of their own country. These small dramatic seabirds with their distinctive colorful beaks nest on Maine's offshore islands every summer, raise their chicks, and then disappear back into the open Atlantic for the winter. Conservation efforts beginning in the 1970s brought puffins back to Maine after hunting had eliminated them from most of their historic nesting sites. Maine has wild puffins, and an overwhelming majority of Americans have no idea this is the case. 65. Maine's border with Canada stretches for hundreds of miles through some of the most remote and least monitored terrain in North America. And throughout both World War I and World War II, this border functioned as one of the most active smuggling corridors on the continent. Goods, people, and contraband moved back and forth through the Maine wilderness with a regularity that federal authorities could not effectively monitor, given the sheer length of the border and the density of the forest covering it. During Prohibition, the same routes carried alcohol. During the wars, they carried other things. Maine's geographic remoteness from the rest of America made it simultaneously the most overlooked and most actively exploited border in the country. 66. Hannibal Hamlin served as Abraham Lincoln's vice president during Lincoln's first term in office, was present at some of the most consequential moments in American history, and came from Hampton, Maine, a fact that approximately 0% of Americans can recall without assistance. Hamlin was replaced on the ticket by Andrew Johnson for Lincoln's second term, which turned out to be one of the most consequential personnel decisions in American political history, given that Johnson became president after Lincoln's assassination and proceeded to undermine Reconstruction with historic effectiveness. Maine produced the vice president who was one slot away from leading the country through its most difficult period, and history forgot his name, his state, and almost everything about him. 67. Maine invented the Italian sandwich in 1902, when a Portland baker named Giovanni Amato began making a specific combination of meat, cheese, vegetables, and oil on a soft roll for the workers and immigrants of Portland's waterfront neighborhood. The sandwich spread across New England, became a regional staple, traveled to other parts of the country under variations of the name, and got absorbed into American food culture so thoroughly that the origin story dissolved along the way. The Italian sandwich that Americans eat in delis and sandwich shops across the country was created in Maine by an Italian immigrant feeding dock workers in Portland, and the rest of America renamed it, claimed it, and forgot where it actually came from. 68. Maine has no major professional sports franchise of any kind, meaning no NFL team, no NBA team, no MLB team, and no NHL team has ever called Maine home, leaving the state completely unrepresented in every major American professional sports league simultaneously. This is a distinction that would send residents of most American states into sustained civic distress and repeated failed stadium referendum campaigns. Maine residents have looked at this situation for generations and responded with what can only be described as complete indifference. There is no sustained public campaign to attract a franchise. There is no political movement demanding a team. Maine simply does not have professional sports and has collectively decided this is entirely fine. 69. Maine became the first state in the country to use ranked choice voting for federal elections, a significant democratic reform that the state legislature had repeatedly refused to act on despite clear public interest in changing how elections worked. Maine citizens responded to legislative inaction by going around the legislature entirely, i.e. gathering signatures, putting the measure on the ballot themselves, and voting it into law through a direct citizen initiative. Then, the legislature tried to repeal it. Maine voters went back to the ballot and voted to keep it again. The citizens of Maine wanted ranked choice voting, Their elected representatives did not want to give it to them, and Maine citizens simply took it anyway through the direct democratic process their constitution permitted. 70. Aroostook County in northern Maine is larger than the combined total area of both Connecticut and Rhode Island, meaning this single Maine county covers more geographic territory than two entire sovereign American states sitting next to each other. Despite this enormous size, Aroostook County has a total population smaller than a mid-sized American suburb, with vast stretches of its interior containing almost no permanent residents at all. Connecticut and Rhode Island together hold millions of people, hundreds of cities, major universities, and dense infrastructure. Aroostook County holds potato farms, forest, snow, and a population so sparse that the county's sheer size makes the emptiness feel almost intentional, as if the land itself decided it preferred the quiet. 71. Maine is the only state in the entire United States of America with a single-syllable name, a linguistic quirk so simple and so obvious that it passes completely unnoticed by virtually everyone until the moment it gets pointed out, after which it becomes permanently impossible to stop noticing. Every other state name has at least two syllables: Texas, Ohio, Iowa, Florida. Maine stands alone in the category of one clean syllable shared by no other state in the Union. Nobody planned this distinction. Nobody celebrates it. Maine did not campaign for the title of America's most efficiently named state. It simply happened. It has always been true, and now that you know it, you will never hear the word Maine the same way again. Maine is one state, with one syllable, and apparently 71 ways to make absolutely no sense whatsoever. Now here is the question that should be keeping you up tonight. If Maine has been this wild this entire time, what is every other state hiding? Drop your state in the comments, and we will expose it next. If this video made you feel something, hit like, subscribe to Dumbest Things, and stay ready because we are just getting started.